But we're going to talk about innovations for all and ensuring access and equity. When we started talking about equity, and I quickly understood that, your definition of equity and the way you think about equity, particularly data equity, is a little different than I had preconception. So maybe that's the place to start. And what does data equity mean to you in terms of providing healthcare access and healthcare research that's actionable?
Great. Thank you for the question. So a little about my background. I am a medical oncologist and left academic medicine about 6 years ago to join Flatiron Health. So my data perspective comes both from patients and then using real world data in clinical study settings as well as regulatory settings. And some of the things I'll be talking about are around the new FDA Diversity Action Plan requirement, which I think applies to everybody in this room. So when I think about equity and equality, they're actually two different concepts, and I have to credit the head of health equity that I hired to Flatiron, who's really been helpful in terms of understanding and describing how equity versus equality impacts our healthcare system. So for example, my husband and I take my kids to a Red Sox game. And now I'm going to use this as an example about the difference between equality and equity. My husband and I are tall, then I have a tween, and then I have a little one. So if we're all sitting in the bleachers and there's big tall people in front of us, my husband and I can see sitting down. My tween can't, and my littlest one can't because we're all in the same seat. So we're equal. We all have a seat. Okay, so now we can all stand up. So now we're still equal. We're all standing up. But I can see, my tween can see, but my littlest one still can't. But we're equal. But is that really what we want in healthcare? Do we want everybody to have the same amount, but actually still not be able to get what they need, in this case, watching the Red Sox? So equity is saying, okay, everybody needs something different. Mom and dad don't even have to stand up. The tween gets to stand up, what he needs, and then the little one, maybe he can sit on my shoulder. So he gets both and an extra boost so that now he also has access to what he needs to be able to enjoy the Red Sox game.
So that's a great distinction. And then when it comes to medical research, the definition of equity, and maybe we just jump right into the new FDA regulations, which I had no idea about until we spoke. But explain how. We should just go to what are the new FDA regulations? How are they being put into effect?
I will go back to your data equity question. So if you look it up online, it's really a framework around how you collect data and how you analyze data, interpret it, and then disseminate it. And I came up with this because you're a journalist, the who, what, why, where,
That's
when.
Nice. I appreciate it.
So those are the 5 questions you can ask yourself when you're thinking about data equity. So who is gathering the data, who is giving the data, and who's going to use it? Who's the end user, the beneficiary, or potentially the person who has a negative consequence before it? What type of data are you collecting? Are you just collecting heart disease status, or are you collecting how much someone drinks or their HPI? So some things are more sensitive to others. Who, what, why are you collecting it? What is the actual question that you're trying to answer within research, clinical research? You always should have equipoise, so you should be doing it to answer an actual question rather than just a embellishment of an opinion. Who, what, why, where. Where, I had to do a little bit of a stretch, but here, where's the biases? Where's the biases and the power differentials between who's collecting the data and who's giving the data? And when is this happening? But more importantly, when do people get to know? Are the results being shared with all the communities affected? And each of those who, what, why, when, where's, there can be differentials between one group of people versus another group of people in terms of how it's impacted, what data you're collecting, what completeness you're collecting, when the people get the results and how they can understand it and utilize it. So at each of those different 5 journalistic points, you can have differentials, and being aware of where those are, and our own biases we all bring to any research question can really be helpful to try to uncover and address as you can, we're not perfect, any inequities that are there within the data gathering analysis piece, because you have to have all of that in place in order to be able to implement the action-oriented to achieve the ultimate equity and health outcomes.
So before we get to what the FDA rules are trying to fix, we list some examples of problems and inequities in data that have sort of been a legacy aspect of the healthcare system.
Talking about legacy, this really first came up in cardiovascular trials, maybe 20, 25 years ago, where all of our hypertension medication, who was talking about hypertension earlier? It was you?
It was me.
It was all done on white men, and women also have heart attacks, but their way they present with heart attacks is very different. So there was a big movement about 20 years ago to try to get women into cardiovascular studies. So that was one of the very earliest and very obvious places where there's an inequity in who is collecting the data, what data is being collected, and what patients are being understood in terms of, does a particular beta blocker impact somebody's risk of a heart attack?
More examples?
More examples, okay. More recently, so the FDA has been thinking about diversity and representativeness in clinical trials for quite a while. The first sort of big key point was back in 2013. The FDA, with congressional mandate, looked at all the drugs that were approved in 2011, just to get a lay of the land about what demographics are even being reported, and if there are being reported, what's our representativeness? Does it represent and include people from across the US? And they found a large proportion of trials did not actually, even in the public reports, and sometimes even in the data that was submitted to the FDA, include all of the characteristics that you would want to know about someone's demographics. So usually age and gender were there, but not necessarily race and ethnicity. Certainly things like language barriers or socioeconomic status were not there. And that really started the discussion around, well, now that we've identified a problem, how can we address it? And there's been numerous studies since then around demonstrating the lack of representativeness in multiple different types of trials. I'm an oncologist, so in the medical oncology space, this is definitely true. And trying to understand the sources of that lack of representativeness, which is really around the healthcare delivery. Sounds like a tech solution in there, to get patients enrolled in trials, to get patients to the places where they can and be enrolled in trials. And so there's a lot of different complexities around the social determinants of health that led to these inequities of participation in clinical trials. And
there's a lot of the screening, because, you know, when we first started talking about it, I was like, oh, so this is easy problem to fix. We just need to make sure we have both men and women. We need to have people of all races represented. But that's often not the way these trials are being assembled. There could be other comorbidities that seem totally, you know, legitimate from a scientific perspective, whether it's obesity rates or liver function, that you're screening out candidates for. But it turns out those biomarkers also correlate with certain ethnic groups or racial groups or socioeconomic groups. And like that's the part that I hadn't really thought about.
Yes, someone in here was a data nerd, I think, self-described, I think they left. But it's really talking about confounders and what confounders you can control at baseline and what baseline factors are correlated both with, in this case, a exclusion criteria based on liver or kidney function and the outcome itself. So if Black Americans have a higher rate of multiple myeloma, they also may have a higher rate of kidney function due to the fact that they actually, because of social determinants of health, maybe got diagnosed later, and therefore the myeloma has already affected their kidney. Therefore, even though that they're a higher prevalence, they may be less likely to be eligible for a study because something else completely meant that they got diagnosed later by the time they had a kidney manifestation of the disease.
And again, your point is that that may not actually play any role in whatever's being tested for a totally different condition, but it can screen them out and therefore, skew the results.
Yes. In oncology, two of the big ones that there's a lot of discussions around is brain metastasis and also HIV status. So brain metastasis, we do a pretty good job controlling it now for our cancer patients, and HIV is also a chronic disease for many people. But historically, brain mets and HIV positivity were automatic exclusions. And I will confess, when I was a junior writing my first clinical trial, I just copied over the exclusion criteria from a trial that I thought was great. And I didn't actually really think about the HIV part. And once my mentor pointed it out, I was like, actually, you know what? I don't need to exclude my HIV patients as long as they're well controlled. So putting a little bit of thinking through very explicitly, why is this inclusion criteria there? Can I expand my population and increase the generalizability of my results by thinking about it in a more creative way that's focused on the outcome of interest rather than just creating a homogeneous patient population?
So now let's get to the FDA. Much promised. And I was, when you first told me about this, I was like, oh, that must have been something they did 5 years ago that's finally being put into effect. No, just last year, and it's ready to go. So what are the new FDA rules?
Great. So in April 2022, the FDA has published its draft guidance, which is not a requirement. It became a requirement as part of FDORA. So that was passed in December of 2022, the Food and Drug Omnibus Reform Act. And this is what has given the FDA teeth to be able to require a diversity action plan. This is a requirement for all drug therapies that are phase 3 or otherwise registrational. Some exceptions for accelerated approvals and those types of things. And important for this group, it also applies to all IDE medical devices or related tech. And it applies to non-IDEs, but there's a few exceptions there. So talk to your experts if you're interested in learning how it might apply to what you're doing. And this essentially means that to come to the FDA to be able to initiate a registrational phase 3 trial or an IDE, you need to have a diversity action plan. And the diversity action plan, the main components are, please describe who your patient population is in the US. Please tell us what your goals are going to be in terms of enrollment, not a numbers minimum thing, but tell us what you're aiming for. How will you know you've succeeded in having a representative population? And then how will you actually do it? How will you find the sites? How will you keep people enrolled and on the study? And you can see each of those things, that's a tech solution just waiting to happen. So let's find the data. Interoperability was just discussed. How do we get all those different types of data in one place so we can actually truly understand who our patient population is and not have to rely on single institution registrational studies from 20 years ago? And then in terms of defining what those metrics and benchmarks are, that also involves could involve modeling in AI and ML to better understand, as a patient goes through their disease course, what's the likelihood that certain types of patients will, for example, be eligible for a line 2 of a chemotherapy treatment. And then how are you going to do it? Finding those sites, you need that data to be able to understand what those sites are able to do. True story, when I ran clinical trials in academia, the CROs, the clinical research organizations, send you a little sheet, faxing still, and I just guessed how many colon cancer patients, stage 3, I saw every month. I had no idea how to even figure that out, and they didn't even really care. They just wanted me to write down the right number, and we can definitely be better than that. And then certainly enabling clinicians to be able to care for patients on trials more effectively, particularly in places where we don't traditionally have clinical trials. So maybe in a rural area that may be historically under resourced. How do they do a just-in-time trial? That sounds like tech solutions to me. Maybe you can get electronic health record direct to electronic data capture forms automated instead of literally 20-year-olds, copying and pasting lab results into your electronic data capture forms, which is crazy. So I think there's a lot of tech solutions to be able to help our pharma and med tech colleagues be able to meet that requirement, to demonstrate that they know what a representative population is, and then be able to implement it. And if it's not met, that doesn't mean the FDA will, I can't speak for the FDA, but they've said, if it's not met, that doesn't necessarily mean you're not approved, but you may need into a post-marketing situation commitment. We're also looking at real-world data and tech-enabled types of follow-up could be really helpful.
So is there, where would you expect that type of tech solution, providing these diverse pools of subjects, where would you expect that solution to come from? Are there any companies or sectors? Do we need new startups to solve this problem?
Yes and yes. I think there's always room for good ideas. It's relatively crowded in the sense that the clinical research organizations are already up and running, but I think they really can be modernized. And there's a lot of different people really trying to solve this really tough problem. So any really good out-of-the-box idea, I think now is the time to explore it, because we need all the options that are out there, and the company with the best execution of the best ideas, I think will really be able to make a great impact for all of our patients.
Does anyone have a question for Rebecca before we move on? Yeah, here we go. Oh, Joe.
So I see, and maybe I'm missing something, but I see a tension between equity in trial enrollment, the direction of where pharmaceuticals at least, is going, which is precision medicine, where we're looking at much smaller populations, and how those two things don't negate one another, right? Because the reason we have homogeneous trials, regardless of how you make it homogeneous, is to get a strong definitive answer. The more heterogeneity we put into a trial, the less likely we are to get a definitive answer for any of the subpopulations. And I don't know if this is a tech solution. It's almost like we have to rethink what we need to do in order to actually address equity in a precision way, recognizing that in some cases that means a trial with all Black Americans or all Hispanics, and it will be completely, try to make it homogeneous. It will certainly not be, inclusive. It wouldn't be called inclusive, but it would need to be done in order to be able to actually get data that's decision-making and confident for that subpopulation. So I don't know if I'm the only one to see this tension, but I constantly am dealing with this in my mind as to how do we address this in a way that isn't kind of two-faced.
I think you're exactly right, and that's why I like that the FDA starts with describe the patient population. If we had a hypothetical disease where 90% of patients were Hispanic, then actually our trial won't be equal because we would have a large number of Hispanic patients and not as many white patients. But in terms of equity, in terms of the burden of disease on that population, you would have equity.
So follow up. Sorry.
If
you did that, you had 100 person trial. Okay, I'm making it up. And 95 was Hispanic and 5% was white, let's just say. 95 patients in a trial will give you probably a definitive result. 5 is never going to do that. Is that even ethical? Because now you're including those people in there, and you're never going to get any information about them specifically.
It's a tough one. I completely agree with you. And I think that that's part of the ongoing discussion. The FDA certainly hasn't finalized their requirements yet, including exceptions. And I think that's a conversation we need as scientists and at a societal policy level. My personal opinion is that when a company is drafting a diversity action plan, one of the critical pieces, in addition to describing the demographics, is then to go back to the basic science and say, is there a reason why a particular subgroup, in this case, the 5 white people, might have a different reaction or might have a different processing compared to the others? And I think it's an open question. Then if you do the first trial with 95 Hispanics, only 5 whites, are you obligated to go do another trial that expands that subgroup? I don't know. That's a good question.
We had another question in the back.
Yeah, just as a follow-up to that, I think access and equity is also related to just, demographically, whether these people that would be in one of those kind of homogeneous or non-homogeneous specific trials have access to that trial. And in the community, which is where a majority of these people are being treated, those providers do not have access to the research that some of the big institutions like MD Anderson or Mayo Clinic would have. And so I think there's a lot that can still be done as it relates to providing that equity or that access to those community facilities, those providers, so that they could at least compete at that level. I started a company called Deep Lens, which we sold to Paradigm in New York, and we were ingesting Flatiron, we were ingesting the genomics feeds from 8 of those labs like Foundation Medicine and Caris, et cetera. And what was really interesting was that a huge minority of those community providers were actually even thinking about genomic testing. And so precision trials were almost impossible in the community. And I think that's changing a lot. Oncologists who are generalists do not have genomic expertise, and therefore they don't know what they don't know, and they don't know what testing that they should be doing. And so it's like, sorry to say it, but the rich white guys are getting the best treatment, the best access to clinical trials because they can afford to fly to Mayo Clinic and MD Anderson. But all of the others who are in, some small town in Oklahoma have absolutely zero chance of ever getting that sort of access. And I think that's something that needs to change.
I think so, and I do think it's a potential tech solve again, because how can we identify where those clinics are, and then how can we make it possible for both the docs to send the genomic testing for your use case, and also make it easy enough to be able to open a trial and then enroll in a trial.